Amit, let me start with you. Olivia just mentioned that Apple will not break out unit sales and that in April, we know that Tim Cook had said that demand is outstripping supply. So we've got not a whole lot of information to go on here. How do you judge whether there is growth in this new category?
Yeah, to your point, in terms of the supply side, you've seen things improve a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, they started offering Apple Watches at the Apple stores, again, suggesting that supply is kind of ramping up a little bit more. To be fair, the best way we've kind of figured out how to run Apple Watch demand trends is either look at supply chain checks or survey work, and both those things point towards, a slow but steady start to Apple Watches. We think 4 or 5 million units is probably fair game for this quarter and potentially the next one for them.
Tim Cook has said, Anand, that he doesn't want to give details because competitors are looking for it. Is that really why Apple's not being so transparent about product sales?
Look, to step back, this is a high-quality problem, right? In order for a company as large to move the needle on its sales, it needs to have 3 things. You need to have a large market, you need to have a growing market, you need to have a profitable market. With Apple Watch, there is the potential, but the initial start to the category has not been pleasant. It may be comparable to the iPad. That's the one bogey that people might look at to see how the start was. And if
really, but the iPad had a huge launch.
Exactly, and look at the iPad franchise now. So even you have to have
the iPad had a much bigger launch than the Apple Watch.
Sure, and so my point is, even if you have such a good launch in the early trajectory, you have to have staying power. So it's not easy for a company like Apple to enter into a new category like that and hit the cover off the ball, if you may, right off the start.
And look, we know one of the big problems is that people like to ditch their wearables. Amit, a question for you. I believe that 70% of Apple revenue now comes from the iPhone. Do you ever start to worry that Apple is too dependent on one product, the iPhone?
Listen, it's absolutely a concern, especially as they keep gaining market share the way they do. You've got to figure they'll reach a point of saturation at some point where this becomes an issue. At this point, I would say market share is fairly low, but it is an issue. It creates a lot of seasonal volatility to the stock, to their numbers. But their bet has been, can they expand and diversify the ecosystem? And iPhone's nothing but the center or the core of that, but can they get you to do a whole lot of other things, be that streaming music, Apple Watch, and everything else around it, to diversify the revenue base?
Anand, we talked about this earlier, Olivia and I, in the meeting, that Apple's notorious for lowballing guidance, right? For giving really conservative outlooks for the following quarter and then beating its own lowered bar. Earnings per share beat estimates in the last 8 quarters. Revenue beat in 7 of the last 8 quarters. I mean, this is a game that people know very well.
I think the street's caught up to that a little bit. So.
Really? But every quarter they continue to beat.
Yeah, and look, but I think if you delve into the numbers, I think the one particular element of guidance that people will be looking for, and Amit can chime in here as well, is specifically China strength. You've seen momentum be very strong in China. We had some issues with China, and you want to see if consumers particularly affected and if the momentum continued in the June quarter, and hopefully it continues in the second half of the year.
How important is the China mobile partnership?
It is pretty significant. I mean, the big 3 in China will drive a significant amount of sales, and so China is the big sort of nascent market on a relative basis for them.
Well, I mean, how vulnerable, or what part of Apple's business is most vulnerable to the macro weaknesses that you are seeing in China?
So if you look at the stats on Apple, China has grown 70% year over year for 2 quarters in a row. For the last 2 quarters, actually accounted for 50% of the incremental dollars Apple has had. So it's extremely important. It's extremely relevant for them. And what you have, Anand said this, right? You have headwinds from a macro perspective, but you also have a tailwind where 4G rollouts are going rather rampantly in China. So you have 2 different crosscurrents. It will be interesting to see which one wins. We do think things slow down from the 70% bogey, but eventually the 4G installations will be far more important and a positive driver than the macro concerns you have right now.
Amit, in your note, you said that there's a lot of potential for upside surprise on margins. Where would that be coming from?
If you look historically, the S cycle, which is what they're going to come up with fairly soon, has had somewhere between 150 to 200 basis points of better gross margins for a very simple reason, which is Apple doesn't change the form factor of the S cycle, so you have better yields, better learning curve efficiencies. I think that's going to be the bigger story for them next year, is that margin expansion.
Yeah.
I need to ask you about the Apple car, Anand. There was a report today that Apple hired Doug Betts, an executive from Fiat Chrysler, who's got expertise in manufacturing. How does an Apple car fit in with its existing suite of products and the whole Apple ecosystem?
Look, it's one of the three, right? Large, growing, profitable. The car category isn't growing that much. It's not that's particularly profitable. Gross margin on a car is roughly about 16, 17, 18%.
Yeah.
Current gross margin
Well,
on
I don't
a car
know.
is 39%.
I don't know what your comp is, but I'm not sure. Is it Ford or is it Tesla? I don't know.
Yeah, and operating margin is lower, and it's single digits is good. So it's not particularly profitable. Unit growth is in the single digits, but it is very, very large. So it has one of the three. So it is, roughly $20,000 per car, give or take, 80 to 85 million cars per year made. That's what our auto analyst Kevin Tynan says. So, yeah, I don't know how you gauge, how Apple gauges how attractive it is relative to those three factors. And I think, we'll wait and see.
Yeah.
But either way, it'll take a long time for it to develop.
Look, they got a lot of cash.
They do.
They have room to take.
They have room for a loss leader, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm a lot more interested in an Apple car than an Apple Watch.
absolutely.